Well, good morning. Man, come on, we could do better than that. All right, there we go. See, now you're awake. I don't know about you, but I'm excited. And if you don't know me, my name is Andrew. I'm the campus pastor here at our Phoenix campus. And I am glad you're here in person or watching online. And man, I'm so stoked today. Like, I've already doubled my exercise goal. And I watched Josh bounce here, and this already has some give. So at any point, the stave is going to cave in. So I might lose it. But anyway, we are so glad that you are here today. And today we're talking about hope. If you didn't get that communicated yet, I'm going to throw it to you right there. We literally dropped a banner of hope. It says hope behind me. We have a giant sign out front that says hope. And this Easter, we are talking about the hope that we have. Because if we're being honest, you look at our world around us, and there's not a lot of hope out there. You see, every time I prepare for a message, I go and I study my Bible, I read commentaries, I kind of get the background and say, what does this say? And then I go and study our world and our culture. I'm saying, what are they saying? And in the midst of that, usually I just Google a lot of things or go drive around. And as I was doing that, I found this website called worldometers.info. I encourage you to check it out, not right now, because then you won't listen to me the rest of the time. You're like, ooh, numbers. But it's a very refreshing website because it's literally just numbers. There's no articles on it. There's no Fox or CNN or anything else in between. There's no telling you what these numbers mean. It's just straight up data. But it's also overwhelming because these numbers either keep ticking up or keep ticking down. And it's just numbers and numbers and numbers. And then I was like, well, let's dig into some of these. Today, through this COVID pandemic, we've now seen 2.8 million people lose their life. That's a big number. And then I'm like, well, of course our world is hopeless. Of course it's a world that's full of some depression. We just went through a pandemic like none of us have ever seen. But then I kept digging, and I kept going in. And then I saw numbers, and just in 2021, from January through March, 2.7 people have died of hunger in our world. You dig a little farther, and you see that 206 people have died because of a lack of clean water. 260,000 people have committed suicide. We're just talking in 2021 here. 1.2 million people have died of smoking. 600,000 people have died of alcohol. 400,000 people have died of HIV or AIDS. And already 10 million people, 10 million babies unborn have died in abortions. You see, our world, no matter what cultural, social worldview you look through, our world is full of a lot of darkness. Our world is full of a lot of brokenness. Our world is full of a lot of despair, and our world is full of a lot of death. And today, as we dive in, I want us to say is, how do we find hope in a world like that? How do we find hope when everything else around us looks so hopeless? And then how do we become a people of hope? And how do we lead in a city of hope? Well, as we dive into that today, let me give you a key thought that is kind of going to guide our thinking first of where we do not find it. And I wanted to say this is, you won't find a city of hope looking at a world full of despair. I'm a native to Arizona. Any natives out there? Raise your hand online. Literally no one. One person. Fantastic. That's great. Me and you, Jacob. So that's how it is. I always meet people. I'm like, where are you from? They're like, oh, I'm from here. And I'm like, I grew up here my whole life. They're like, why would you live in Phoenix your whole life? I was like, why did you move here? Like, because it's awesome, right? Apparently none of you think so. You're like, it's Easter and it's like 95 degrees outside. But so I've lived here my entire life. And my dad, growing up, really taught me two things. Unintentionally or intentionally, whatever it is, that I go to church every Sunday, and that I root for Arizona sports teams. Okay, none of you care. But Arizona sports teams, meaning Cardinals, ASU, Suns, Diamondbacks, and Coyotes. I mean, it's hockey. Does anyone really care? But not U of A, because I like to say that's northern Mexico. But so my whole life, I've rooted for Arizona sports. And if you know me, I'm an extreme optimist when it comes to my teams. Every offseason, I said, man, we're killing it. We're going forward. We're going to be in the playoffs. We're going to compete for a championship this year. You know how many championships we have in my life? 1. So I've been wrong a lot. But this year, as optimistic as I am, Suns are the number 2 seed, as optimistic as I am, there's some things that you know have no hope. The Diamondbacks this year have no hope. Their season just started. They're 0-3. I knew it was going to be bad from the get-go. I'm going to the home opener. I'm like, this is going to be ugly. But I know this year that there is no hope for the Diamondbacks. And you see, sometimes when we look at our world, we can get lost in the fact that there's not much to hope in there. We can stare at the brokenness and the ugliness, and we know that there's not a lot of hope to pull from. But here's our encouragement today, is though this isn't the first time our world has looked bleak. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and flip to John chapter 20. And in John chapter 20, we're going to see kind of the first Easter. And if you don't have a Bible, you can grab the one in chair in front of you, or you can look up all these notes in the YouVersion Bible app. But in John chapter 20, a little background before we get into this, is the book of John was known as a gospel to chronicle the life of Jesus. It literally starts from his birth. That's what we celebrate at Christmas. A lot of people know the birth of Jesus, but then the resurrection of Jesus, that's a whole another crazy thing. But it chronicles his birth, and then it sees he grows up, and then in his 30s, he began his ministry, began his life's work. And Jesus started to travel around the known world at that time, what was referred to as Galilee. In the region of Galilee, had about 205 different cities or provinces, and in these areas probably made up a population of about 3 million. And in the 3 years Jesus lived, he probably, historians think, hit almost, if not everyone, close to every single one in his impact. He went around, he taught, he healed, and crowds started coming to him. People started flocking to him. And then there was people that became even closer. He had 70 who devoted most of their life to him. He had 12 that literally dropped everything and followed him. He had 3 he personally poured into. And these people gave up everything. Their jobs as fishermen, as political figures, as tax collectors, even former demon-possessed and prostitutes dropped their life and followed this guy. Everything was looking great. Everything was moving forward until they saw him get arrested. They saw him nailed to a cross. They saw him beaten, bloodied, miserable, and then ultimately died, wrapped up and laid in a borrowed tomb. And these people who devoted their lives, these disciples that were so passionate, that were so excited, all of a sudden they got a gut check and said, what in the world is happening? Well, today we're going to look at how did they respond, and how do we respond coming out of a time of darkness and despair? How do we respond when this has been one of the worst years most of us have seen in our life worldwide, of a tragedy, of a time like that? Is how do we respond? Well, I think we can take some lessons from the first time this happened to Jesus' disciples. And in John chapter 10, the first response that we see is that sometimes we can fall trapped to this as well, is we disappear away from everyone. Check out John chapter 20, starting in verse 10. It says this, then the disciples returned to the place where they were staying. Now, let's get a little background on this. The disciples, as soon as Jesus died, they gave up their life, they followed him, and as soon as it was done, they hit the door. They're like, I'm out of here. They left, they ran back to their old life. And then on Easter, things seemed to be even getting worse, because they actually went to the tomb to pay their respects. And when they went to do that, to see Jesus' gravesite, the stone was rolled away, and they looked inside and it was empty. And they didn't think, oh man, he's raised from the dead, this is great. Instead, they said, somebody stole Jesus' body. So it was just another gut punch, another hurt, and they didn't ultimately understand that this was a good thing, but they saw it as a further blow to their cause. And how did they respond? They went home, they hid, and they holed up away from everybody else. And I couldn't stop to think about the parallels today. We had a pandemic. We were told to go home, right? Introverts love that. They're like, go home and don't leave your house. And you're like, got it. But we were told to go home, to stay away, to help slow the spread. And I'm not, that's good. And we need to do that. And I'm not going to make commentary on it. But instead, here's what so many happened is we didn't just physically go home to social distance from a pandemic. Instead, many of us, we went home and we disappeared mentally, we disappeared socially, we disappeared emotionally, and we disappeared spiritually from everyone. I was researching more and saw these alarming statistics that at the end of 2020, streaming TV content rose by 44%. You're like, yeah, I only accounted for 11% of that. But it's like streaming TV by 44% went up in the last quarter of 2020. Now think about that for a second. We didn't all cut the cord of cable like last year. We did that like 5 years ago. So that means our society watched 44% more TV than it ever had before. Wow. I mean, I love to binge, but let's be honest, the more I watch sports or a show, it doesn't make me smarter and more productive in society. But then emotionally or socially, we see this as well. Scott mentioned this last week that during this time of COVID, that there's been a spike in teen suicide rates because of the lack of socialization they've been able to have with people around them. And studies have shown that the value that they're pushing of kids need to socialize by certain ages, otherwise they have developmental delays later on. Emotionally, in 2021 compared to 2020, we have seen a 4-time increase in health and anxiety and mental health disorders that have risen. And spiritually, in the midst of COVID, 30% of people who attended a church stopped attending either in person or online. And to make matters even crazier is they've shown that probably for the first time in our country, there was a steady hold that 70% of people in our country, Americans, claim to be part of some religious gathering that has now dipped for the first time under 50%. You see, the disciples ran and hid away. And we ran and had to hide away. But see, the problem is when we not just disconnect physically and socially distance, but when we disappear mentally and socially and emotionally and spiritually from the world around us. It's not that we just disappeared physically, but we disappeared from life itself. But you see, this wasn't the only response that we see. Not only was there a response of disappearance from the world around them, but there was also a response of tears for loved one. Check out verse 11. It says, "But Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she was crying, she stopped to look into the tomb." You see, Mary was crying not only because Jesus, a loved one in her life, was dead, but on top of that, his grave was defiled. Many of us have lost loved ones this past year. There was a couple in our church during COVID whose mom became sick. And as their mom became sick, it increased to deteriorate. In the last month of their mom's life that eventually passed away, they couldn't visit in the hospital. And then when they went to make arrangements, they couldn't even hold a funeral service. And they got to do viewings 2 by 2 through a funeral home to say their goodbyes and couldn't gather their family together. See, this has been a tough year, and there have been tears shed, there have been hardships, and one of the things, when things are hard, we go in one of the avenues is we grieve, we cry, we be overwhelmed by everything, the pain in our world and the hurt we have endured, but not only do we disappear, not only do we shed tears, but we also have fear that our enemies have won. Check out verse 19. It says, "When it was evening of that first day of the week, the disciples were gathered together with the doors locked because they feared the Jews." Now I want to stop right there. It says because they feared the Jews. We get a little bit of background here from verse 10 that the place they went to was a locked door. They went into a locked house. They literally held up and were like, no, nobody's getting in. And they actually did this, and it wasn't to social distance. Rather, it was because fear from their enemies. You know, I think it's funny in seeing the parallels today. During an election year, often you see a lot of anger and crazy and malice and screaming out of injustice and afraid of the path we're going down. During an election year, especially one that changes parties, we get to see that shift in momentum. What do I mean? Well, if you're awake in 2020, you saw a lot of people who would be more on the left side say that our world's going to end, our president's terrible, this is horrible, we're all going to die, we're going down the wrong path. Fast forward to 2021, and all those emotions have just moved to the other side. If you're around me a lot, I'm pretty apolitical. I'll make you mad on both ways. But we see that our world buys into this thing that if my enemy, if those I disagree with get in power, they're going to make my life harder, and my life is going to be over. And you see it even gets worse if you don't believe me in this idea is I just encourage you, go read Twitter. Go read something controversial on Twitter, which maybe that's redundant. And just go read a tweet on Twitter, and then you'll find it's controversial. And then go read comments for like 5 minutes, and you'll see the anger and the malice. Your blood will start boiling. Your head will start spinning because we've bought into this lie that I have to engage in every fight. I have to comment on every post I disagree with. I have to get mad and riled up about something that has nothing to do with me. And I have to yell at the hate mongers who are pressing me, because anyone who disagrees with you is a hate monger, if you didn't know that. Because if I don't do it, then my enemies will win. And if my enemies win, they will make my life miserable. The irony in the story just before this is Peter, one of the leading disciples of Jesus. Right before Jesus was arrested, he cut a dude's ear off. And he got into a fight he didn't need to pick. How do we know it's a fight he didn't need to pick? It's because Jesus took the dude's ear and put it back on his head and healed him. That would have been pretty cool to see. I don't know if the blood was still there or what. But he told him, no, we're not picking this fight. But then as the story progressed, and as Jesus died and they thought they had lost the war, Peter went and ran away in fear of his enemies. And you see, fear is a terrible response to trials in our life. When things get hard, when things get hopeless, when we let fear guide us and get into our mind, it can become a terrible master. Last week, I sat down with a guy who was struggling with kind of some mental illness and trying to get over and was trying to refer and help, but we kept going down a path. And I was trying to put resources and say, hey, here's where we can go. Here's what we can kind of guide back. And it always came back to this point where there are people following me. There are things in my life that are out to get me. And I can't turn my back because if I do, if I'm not paying attention, they'll grab me and they'll kill me. You see, fear had become a master in this person's life. And fear had wreaked its havoc. And when we give in to the fear, when we give in to the crazy in our world, it can cause us to look at our world and get even more depressed and even more hopeless. But then something stopped that fear in our story. Check out the rest of the verse in verse 19. The second half of this said, it said they were hiding because they feared the Jews. But then Jesus came. He stood among them and he said to them, peace be with you. You see, the opposite of fear is trust. And trust in the future and something greater is hope. And hope here in the form of Jesus himself showed up. But here's what's crazy. Even when Jesus showed up, sometimes, even when that hope comes, some still will not be ready for it. Check out the final bad response we see to something hard in our world, to tragedy happen, and we see as we can smear the message of the hope that is to come. Check out, let's keep reading in verse 24. He said, but Thomas, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. 25, so the other disciples were telling him, we've seen the Lord. But he, being Thomas, said to them, if I don't see the mark of the nails in his hand, if I don't put my finger into the mark of the nails and put my hand into his side, I will never believe. You see, the disciples, as good friends, when Jesus shows up, they go and they tell their friends. They go and tell the rest of the disciples. They tell their family and they say, hey, I know all hope is lost, but Jesus is back. And then Thomas hears this and he's like, no way. Because you see, this was actually mind-blowing in their day. Is the Jews, they didn't expect someone just to resurrect straight back up. Actually, in Jewish culture, when someone died, they went to Sheol. I like to picture Sheol, it's like kind of like a waiting place until judgment. It's like a doctor's office. They're all waiting, chilling in there. So I'm gonna be like, hey, what's up, Moses? How long you been here? He's like, it's been a while, dude. And they're waiting there, and so they're like expecting like this waiting ground, and then Jesus later on, or a Savior will come and bring all Israel back to glory. So when Jesus came back in 3 days, Thomas like, dude, did you read the Old Testament? Like that's not how it works. Like that's not what we're expecting. Like Jesus was teaching them this, but they didn't understand it. They couldn't wrap their heads around it. And he says these words, I will never believe. And the words he actually uses there were common in saying that you don't trust something He was calling it propaganda. He was saying there's no truth in it. It was the first century view of saying #fake news. Don't you love fake news, right? Like April Fool's Day last week, and people like to post a lot of bogus stuff like, hey, so-and-so got traded to this team, or I'm a big superhero fan, so it's like, hey, they cast this guy in Fantastic Four, and I'm like, that's a lie, that's not happening. And two of you care. But anyway, so he was like, Tom is like, I'm not believing this. This is garbage. This isn't true. This isn't happening. And the problem was, even in the face of truth, Thomas couldn't accept it past his own negativity. And you see, all of us can fall into these traps. We can disappear from the world around us. We can be lost in our mourning and our tears. We can run in fear from our enemies, or we can smear and throw down any hope that is to come. But we see here in the story that there is a shift. And the final response in a time of despair is we see how the disciples persevere with hope in the Son. Let's keep reading in verse 26. It says, a week later, his disciples were indoors again, and Thomas was with them. Even though the doors were locked, Jesus came and he stood among them. He said, peace be with you. Verse 27, then he said to Thomas, put your fingers here and look at my hands. Reach out your hand and put it to my side. Don't be faithless, but believe. He's countering Thomas's words here. He said, I'll never believe, but he's saying, believe. It's like Jesus knew what he said. Verse 28, Thomas responded to him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. And in verse 30, and some Bibles mark this section as is the purpose of this gospel, the reason John wrote these words, it says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, the Savior, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You see, there was hope for the disciples again. There was hope because everything they had worked for, everything they put their lives entrusted to was Jesus himself. And when he died, they lost it. But when he came back, all of a sudden that hope came back with it. But here's the irony, is they thought when Jesus died, this is terrible because our life is going to be so much harder, because they thought their enemies were going to hunt them, even though we don't see that indication. The Jews were trying to attack them. But the irony is they were so scared when Jesus died. But when Jesus came back, they started telling people about that message. And when they started telling people Jesus is alive, when they started telling people Jesus is God, it's when they were yelled at, when they were mocked, when they were beaten, and many of them killed. And you see, if you look at our world today, it's not going to magically get better. We aren't going back to a normal. If we go to a normal, it's going to be a new normal. We're going to complain about that normal because it's not like the old normal, right? Like we think, oh, we're going to get done with COVID and everything's going to be great. We tried that with 2021, and then it's like, hey, we're getting worse. It's like, what in the world is happening? But it's not going to like magically fix itself and get better. But I think what COVID revealed more than anything is that the hopelessness in our world is because we came face to face with the reality of death. You see, death is scary. Death has a permanency to it, has a finality to it. Just this morning, during our 9 o'clock service, we had a car accident right out front, and we're pretty positive someone lost their life. Just like that, death can happen. It can be around every corner. It can happen in our world. We read the statistics that you take out COVID and people are still dying every single day. And that is, there is a hopelessness in that. There's a scariness to that. But the good news here is that Jesus is alive. The good news here is that death has been defeated, that death is not final. And we're going to bring this full circle today, and I want to give you an Easter truth this morning, that when we look at the hopelessness of our world, we can have hope in our God because the hope of our future was secured in the resurrection of his past and is living in your present. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 illustrates this beautifully. It said, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Why do we bless our God and Father? Why? Because of his great mercy. The Bible tells us that we are dead in our sin and our trespasses. We are dead because we have forsaken God. But because of his grace, because of his mercy, he gave us Jesus. And what do we get from that? He has given us a new birth. What is the opposite of death? His birth and living. No longer do we have to have our old life. No longer are we lost in our death. But we can have a new life, a new birth into a living hope. A hope that endures, a hope that goes forward, a hope that will not be squashed by any death we see in our world, by any pandemic that comes, but a hope that endures. And why do we have this hope? Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. You see, Easter is all about the resurrection. Easter is all about a way forward. Because here's the crazy thing about Christianity. If Jesus never rose from the dead, the entire thing was built on a foundation of lies. If Jesus never raised from the dead, this book belongs in the trash can because it has no true word in it. If Jesus never raised from the grave, then why the heck are we here? Because I am not that entertaining. Clearly, you haven't laughed all, there you go, loosen you up. But if Jesus never raised from the grave, then there is no hope. But he did. And you see, we rejoice in the fact that there are dark days to come. There are dark days that we're still in the midst of. But if we're going to have personal hope and be a people of hope and lead a city of hope, it is going to be built on the foundation that our God is not dead and our God is alive. And if you've never rested in that truth, I hope that God is stirring in your soul right now. That this isn't just another Easter. This isn't just another day. But it's a time to move forward and a time to have a new life. We're going to pray in just a minute. And if today you have never made that choice to follow Jesus, whether you are in person or you are watching with us online, you can say yes to him today. You can say yes to the hope of the resurrection. Church, are we ready to live a life grounded in that hope? Let's pray.